The fact that there is no obvious answer tells you something. What that tells you is you have to make it your own.
Vikram, not only president and CEO of Collegium Pharmaceuticals, but Vikram brings an incredible track record of leadership in biopharma, having guided organizations through transformative growth and delivering strong financial performance in some of the industry's most complex environments.
When we think about AI, it's certainly the buzzword and everybody's saying it. I'm not sure people have figured out exactly what it means for them. And that tells me is that before we start thinking about leveraging AI and solutions, you got to first figure out where you're going to use it and what your needs are.
What's advice you would give to some of those folks who are maybe chief commercial officer on what they should think through to ultimately go down the path of becoming a CEO of a company like Collegium?
I think people love the idea of being a CEO. I think you just have to go in with eyes wide open that comes with a lot of responsibility and accountability. You need to be able to lead an organization. You need to have a really clear understanding in your own mind as to what is the appropriate amount of risk that you believe your organization should be willing to take.
So first and foremost, I'm really excited by today's conversation. When I first spoke with Vikram, I was sitting in my car in Montana. I just landed from a flight, and his energy is contagious, to say the least. So I'm really excited that you'll all have an opportunity to get to learn and hear more from Vikram. We're going to capture every aspect of who he is, not just his incredible role as president and CEO of Collegium Pharmaceuticals, but we're also going to capture the human side of Vikram as well. So I want to welcome everybody to this exciting Kinara podcast, which again, from life sciences for life sciences, where we really bring industry's brightest minds, innovators, executives, physicians, and technologists to share important insights from the industry. As I said before, Vikram, not only president and CEO of Collegium Pharmaceuticals, but Vikram brings an incredible track record of leadership in biopharma, having guided organizations through transformative growth and delivering strong financial performance in some of the industry's most complex environments. Prior to Collegium, he held a senior leadership role at Horizon Therapeutics, helping steer the company into a rare disease powerhouse and overseeing an extraordinary revenue expansion that ultimately led to its integration with Amgen. Now, at Collegium, Vikram, I know we're excited about this one. Before we get into Collegium, Vikram, I want to start off with your background. You've had an incredible journey. Your journey started outside of pharma. So I want to hear what that journey was like. And then I also want to learn a little bit more about how many of those learnings from outside of pharma are now applying to some of the roles and work you're doing as CEO at Collegium.
Thanks, Chase. Happy to be here. And I'll start with my education. I'm an electrical engineer by training. I was born and raised in India. And this one little bit is important. My late father, was an electrical engineer. My mother is a retired anesthesiologist. And so growing up, I had exposure to both the engineering side of science as well as the biology side of science, and was able to see it very, very closely. I remember being a boy, I think 7, 8, 9 years old, and in those days I would follow my mom as she headed to the hospital for surgery, and I didn't understand a lot, but the one thing I could see was at the end of surgery, she was the one who was going to meet with the family of the patient. And just the impact that those words had, not just forget about the surgery, but the impact that her words had as she was talking to those family members was very powerful. Right? And so when you take a step back and think about life sciences, not just pharmaceuticals, but healthcare overall, it is such an essential part of our lives. And any role that I could play, as I envisioned this the rest of my life as a young boy, any role that I could play, I wanted to be a part of it. So electrical engineer by training, worked in the engineering industry in R&D for a few years, got my MBA, came out of MBA, went into consulting, and my first client was a healthcare client, medical devices. And I had a chance to bring the best of both, right? Again, my experience as an engineer as well as being in the medical device field. I really enjoyed it. I mean, there is nothing else more exciting, inspiring than going to work and thinking that everything I do today is going to make an impact to somebody's life. Very powerful feeling. Sounds a little cheesy, but trust me, when you think about it, it is very powerful and it's very motivating. And that's really what's kind of set off my journey in healthcare. I've worked in medical devices for a few years, worked in cell therapy for a couple, then eventually made the move into pharmaceuticals, and then the journey with Horizon started back in 2014, which led to the transformation of the company from where we were at the time into a rare disease powerhouse, and then finally the acquisition by Amgen. And today here I am trying to make an impact within Collegium.
Vikram, one of the conversations we had on our last chat was around, again, you gave me the backstory on Horizon. You were telling me that it was not always a rare disease company. I know that I'd love for everybody to hear that. I know some people know the backstory for Horizon, but for those that don't, I think it's really interesting for them to learn and understand how Horizon repositioned itself into a rare disease powerhouse, even though they didn't start as one. Because that's a good tell for so many executives and entrepreneurs who might start down a different path, and a lot of the learnings and lessons and also the foundation might lead to financial investment in other areas that will transform the company.
Absolutely. When I joined the company back in 2014, so take a step back. Horizon was operational and had been founded by Tim Walbert way back when in 2008. Ran a clinical trial for a medicine, an NSAID, and that was the first drug that came to market. That was called Duexis. An amazing product. I hit the market in 2012, I believe. And I joined in 2014. And when I joined, we were not a rare disease company. We were a company that was building a portfolio of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medicines. Right. So we had Duexis, we had Vimovo, which had been acquired from AstraZeneca, and we had Pennsaid 2% that had just been added into the portfolio. So a really strong portfolio of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medicines doing extremely well, meeting a lot of unmet need for patients. But we also knew at the time that, at some point, as is the case in our industry, these medicines, they go through a life cycle. And we as a company are no different. We would need to do something, either extend the life cycle of the medicines, add more products into the portfolio, or in some cases, make a strategic pivot into a new area. And I remember back in 2014, we would sit down as a management team and talk about what is this next pivot? Where are we going to go? And that's when we first started our move into rare disease. In September of 2014, we acquired a company called Vidara Therapeutics, which had a medicine called Actimmune, rare disease medicine. And that was our first foray into rare disease. And after that, I mean, I look back at it now, and of course, it makes so much sense. At the time, it felt like a whirlwind. Every 6 months or so, we were adding a new medicine into the portfolio. We acquired a company called Hyperion Therapeutics, which brought Ravicti. A few months later, we acquired Crialta, which brought us Prestessa. Then a few months later, we acquired Raptor Pharmaceuticals, which brought us Precispia. Before you know it, in a span of 2 years, we had created a very strong rare disease business, which had a significant amount of longevity left in its life cycle. So, it was fascinating to observe us as a company, because you had, on the one side, we had our the business that was the foundation of the company, but appealing to tens of thousands, if not millions of patients. And then the other side of the business, which was growing and was our future, which was serving the needs of a couple hundred patients at a time. I mean, the dichotomy here was unmistakable. And I remember it wasn't just about adding products to a portfolio. It was also about how we had to adjust and adapt our mindset to serving the needs of patients in an ultra-rare condition, as well as non-steroidals, which was serving millions of patients, and how we had to figure out how to operationalize this, not just in terms of how we brought the message to market, but culturally what it meant for us. It was perhaps one of the most rewarding times of my career, but also learned a lot.
I believe it. I was at a conference last week. It's actually one of my favorite conferences each year. It's called the Laguna CEO Summit. It's all pharma CEOs, from large pharma companies to smaller biotechs. And one of the debates that I was having, I won't say any names, but if they're listening, they know who I'm talking about. One of the individuals is a CEO of a very big, very, very large pharma company. We were having a conversation about really the fact that how do you do M&A right? There's so many businesses that it's very easy to do M&A wrong. And you have a lot of really large pharma companies right now that are towards the end of their life cycles and some of their biggest products, Merck with Keytruda, we see it over and over and over again. AbbVie with Humira, and a lot of companies are too scared. They're too worried to take risk. And I know that Mark Zuckerberg, one of the quotes that he had is, not taking risk is the biggest form of risk. When you think through your time at Horizon and even the history prior to you even joining, and the risk that the organization took making these big acquisitions, which ultimately led to a big success, what's advice you'd give to these other CEOs? Some of them large pharma CEOs, big pharma CEOs that might be listening right now. What's advice you'd give to them when it comes to taking the risk approach way that you took and how that ended up being really beneficial for the company?
Yeah, look, there's no one size fits all answer to this question, right? I think that taking calculated and educated risks is part of what we do. I mean, there's the age-old saying about you're never going to score a goal if you don't take a shot, right? I mean, we've heard this over and over again in sports, and the same thing applies here. If we want to continue to evolve the organization, and by the way, we can talk about transformation and transformational change, growth mindset. The fact is that change is not something, or a transformation is not something that is a one-time activity. It is a constant. And if you adopt that mindset that we must continue to evolve, then I think you get a little bit more comfortable with the concept of taking risks, because it doesn't feel like this thing that you have to do once and get it right, and then after that you're out in the clear. And I think that's when you start thinking about evolution of the organization as a continuous process as opposed to a one-time thing. I do think that the entire organization then adopts that type of a mindset. And then, that now you've got everybody enrolled in that process. I mean, I think one of the things that I remember we enjoyed, I would say, back in those days at Horizon, everybody was rowing in the same direction. The ship was moving in one direction, and everybody was in it with the same mindset that, look, we must take educated risk, calculated risk, but we must take it. And we must enjoy it, and we must learn from it. One of the things we would do often is something that I know you and I talked about this the last time we spoke, but everybody looks at the successes that we had at Horizon. Well, we had some stumbles along the way that either were public or not, and I think we learned as much, if not more, from those stumbles than we then did from our successes. But the culture was one where you took that risk, and if it didn't work out, what you learn, and well, you know what, don't keep repeating the same thing over and over again. Don't make the same mistake, but it's okay to make a mistake, learn from it, and go to try to take your best shot again. And I'd say that whether you're a big company or a small company, I think that's the mindset of that I would encourage leaders and organizations to have, which is don't be afraid of taking risk. Take calculated and educated ones, celebrate the successes. Don't be afraid to fail, learn from those failures, but make sure that there's an environment that's created in the organization that it's okay to take some risk.
I really wish, and I hope that some of the people listening that are CEOs of some of those companies take that advice to heart. Vikram, the issue that I note with some of them might say is that it's challenging because of when you're a larger organization, there's a lot more bureaucracy. And there's so many other boxes. Even as CEO, you don't have the ability to just unilaterally make the decision to say, go buy this asset or go buy that asset. It'll be you'll be a big influential decision maker in that process, but you still need to get board approval. There's other stakeholders that might need to check the box. What advice do you give to some of those who are working in more of those bureaucratic institutions when it comes to applying that very successful playbook from your past company?
I don't know if I would call that bureaucracy, Chase. I think, look, there's a process that everybody must follow, right? I mean, nobody's going to go out there and just make frivolous decisions about investment and taking risk. At least I would not recommend that, no matter what size of company you are. as the size of the company grows, naturally, there's just a few more people that have to be involved, and I think that it's a question of making sure that the process accounts for that. And there's a difference between, I think, bureaucracy and following a disciplined process. Whether you're a small company or a large company, if you recognize the discipline that you must follow, I don't think that I would call that bureaucracy. Now, look, there are plenty of organizations, again, size aside, where there's just a culture of being overly risk averse. And I think that is not only a function of the size of the organization. I think that exists in smaller organizations also. And to me, it's more about establishing your threshold of risk, making sure everybody understands what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do, what type of risk you're willing to take, what you're not willing to take. Get agreement on that upfront. It makes for a much smoother decision-making process and much more disciplined, by the way, right? So that's what I would suggest. And it's less about bureaucracy. I would say one thing, though, when I was, again, back to 10 years ago, I remember we were sitting outside a regional sales meeting, and Tim and I were talking about as a small company, how do you differentiate yourself when you're in your business development process? And for us, it was speed. Speed was a competitive advantage for us. And we were successful time and time again because we could move fast, make decisions quicker. But it wasn't because we just disregarded other people's input. It was because we had pre-established what risk we're willing to take. And that allowed us to be very efficient, quick, but disciplined at the same time.
So the lesson is have the right discipline, have the right internal operational procedures and compliance check marks in place, diligence check marks in place, to be, and when you have those right standards in place, you're going to be more efficient. Kind of reminds me of, it's funny, Vikram, I was one time asked by an orthopedic surgeon when I was in medical school, this was a question that came up. He asked all of us as medical students, he said, would you rather have your knee replacement done on an assembly line process or a job shop style manufacturing process, which is way more custom and specifically focused on you? And every single one of us chose the latter, not the former. And he said, all of you answered incorrectly. Every single one of you should have said assembly line, because there is less error and there is greater speed. And that's because so many of the processes and the disciplines and what seems fast actually has more to do with a lot of the just robust processes that have been put in place to enable that sequence to exist. So go ahead.
Yeah. And what that also does, Chase, and I don't know if you alluded to this, but it also takes the personal bias and emotion out of the picture.
It's true.
I mean, as we know, these are not perfect decisions. There's a lot of individual assessment and judgment that is brought into these types of decisions. So, when you have a disciplined process with established parameters that people can agree upon upfront before going into a specific project or a decision, it just removes some of the bias or the emotion, and it allows you to focus on the facts at hand objectively.
I love it. So it's focus as much on the data and the facts. Don't get too swayed by and I'm sure it can be emotional. A deal making process always gets emotional at certain stages, and you're playing with different people's emotions internally and externally. That's really great perspective.
I think, by the way, to put this in very human terms, it is impossible to take the emotion out 100%, right? It just that just doesn't happen. True. You just have to make sure that the entire decision is not being made purely on emotion.
Makes sense, and it's good to acknowledge those emotions, so
of course,
when they're coming into play. I want to shift, Vikram. There's so many lessons and learnings. I feel like I could talk to you for hours about your time and your journey at Horizon and ultimately through the acquisition process at Amgen. But I really want to focus today's conversation on your role now as president and CEO at Collegium Pharmaceuticals. You very incredible company that's doing some interesting things. And I have to say, there's a lot of, before I get into your specific role, I want to ask one more time, if you could give a piece of advice. There's a lot of C-suite executives at larger scale pharma companies that are also thinking, how can I go, if I don't want to become CEO of this larger pharma org, and I want to go become CEO of a mid-sized manufacturer or even a biotech, what's advice you would give to some of those folks who are maybe chief commercial officer, CMO, CS? Like what is the advice you'd give them on the journey on what they should think through to ultimately go down the path of becoming a CEO of a company like Collegium?
Well, I think first of all, this goes back to, I think people love the idea of being a CEO. Who would, if you're the leader of an organization, you get to work with your team, set the strategy and set the direction of the company. Everybody loves it. I think you just have to go in with eyes wide open that comes with a lot of responsibility and accountability, right? And I think that's just something that folks should give some thought to. That's number one. Number two, the role of the CEO in not just working the operations of a company, but the role of the CEO in working and frankly, being a facilitator with the board is a really important one. And I think if folks have had exposure to working with boards and how observing the interaction between the CEO and a board, and how the CEO works with the board chair, how the CEO works with the rest of the board. I think that's pretty important. There's really no book that kind of teaches you about this. This is experiential. So if you have not had that exposure or experience, I would recommend that you should go and talk to somebody about it and really gain an understanding of because in my experience, at least over the last year or so, I've spent a significant amount of time not just running the operations of the company or setting the strategic direction of the company, but also working with our board in all ways, shapes, and forms. In working with the various committees and working with the board chair to think about what's the appropriate structure of the board, the size of the board, the makeup of the board, and this requires some thinking. And as the CEO, you spend a lot of your time on that. So I think that's just something that folks should give some thought to. The last piece of advice I want to come back to, it ties back to what we talked about, which is risk. Okay. At the end of the day, a lot of choices that you make as a CEO or as a management team introduce an element of risk, or at least they have an element of risk. And what is that threshold of risk that you are willing to sign up for is really critical, because at the end of the day, the buck stops with you. And you need to be able to lead an organization. And in order to do that, you need to have a really clear understanding in your own mind as to what is the appropriate amount of risk that you believe your organization should be willing to take. And giving it some serious thought, because I think I'd say on a daily basis, I encounter situations, whether these are small decisions or large decisions, where you've got to weigh risk every single time. So I just want to give a nod to that whole discussion we had about risk and what a role that has played in, frankly, every decision I'm making on a daily basis.
It's you joined Collegium at a very interesting time.
Yep.
The company is obviously doing very well from a performance perspective. I'm curious, like how do you think about the company's current trajectory and how do you see Collegium shaping not only the future of pain management, but also specialty pharmaceuticals? Yeah.
So when I joined Collegium about a year ago, just under a year ago. And as I was doing my diligence prior to joining, I was talking with members of the board about taking on this role. What was really interesting for me was the fact that this is a company, a few things. The company has done extremely well. If you just look at performance, right, over the last several years, that's the foundation, right? Very strong financial foundation, very strong commercial execution. So taking the medicines that the company has in the portfolio and growing that organically, I think the company has done a remarkable job. And that has been, in fact, the company, Collegium, is known as the leader in responsible pain management. At the same time, this goes back to 2014 horizon, right? And I often say this, coming into Collegium in 2024 was like going into Horizon in 2014. A thriving, strong business which laid the foundation for future growth. In our case, at Collegium, this is the pain management business. Our pain business is extremely strong, highly profitable, throws off a significant amount of cash that is then what we can then leverage in order to create shareholder value, and that comes in the form of doing three things, right? So capital deployment has three. It's a balance of three areas for us. Number one is continue to build the portfolio with other differentiated medicines that fulfill an unmet need for patients, right? Number one. Number two, we have a lot of investors that have had confidence in the company for a long period of time, and creating shareholder value via opportunistically repurchasing shares and returning some of that value to shareholders. That's a second leg of our capital deployment strategy. And number three, we throw off a lot of cash. Paying down our debt and strengthening the balance sheet is call it the third leg of our capital deployment strategy. And I'm happy to say that we're one of the few companies our size that has the ability and has demonstrated the ability to find that balance and do all of this, right? So building off a strong foundation, having the desire as well as the fortitude to now enter a new space, and we'll talk about ADHD in a second, but entering a new area in neuropsychiatry with the acquisition of Ironshore Therapeutics that launched us into ADHD. So diversifying while returning value to shareholders and strengthening the balance sheet. I mean, it's a really compelling story that sets a foundation for a very bright future.
I mean, look, as you're speaking, I'm looking at the free cash flow charts from 2020 to 2024. Everything reinforcing the points that you're making, and it sounds like the way you're thinking about investment there is very smart. Vikram, out of curiosity, I'm thinking through just the conversation. Obviously, I'm kind of shifting back into more of the tech landscape for a second, where you see companies that go through these big transformations, right? Yeah. You look at a company like Slack that started off as a gaming company, and it ended up being an internal communications tool that sold to Salesforce for quite a bit of money. You see Tesla that is building, obviously, an automotive company that's focusing on EVs, and they're now shifting into an entirely new business line around humanoid robotics. We see these transformations. You see the Horizon story starting off with NSAIDs and going after rare. There's so many different examples of a business leveraging its strong financial stance and churning that into newer opportunity. A lot of companies would just lean into what's working. They're not thinking about what's the next landscape, what's the next horizon. They're not thinking about one of those buckets you listed around what are the other areas of potential expansion. So when it came down to, again, moving from pain management to ADHD, what was the thought process there, and why was that the area you guys wanted to start versus some other areas in the neuropsychiatric space?
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, I think when you look at pain management and you look at the world of CNS, psychiatry or neuropsychiatry is a very logical adjacency to go into. The medicine that we acquired, Jornay PM, and we'll talk about that in a second. It's a very compelling, highly differentiated medicine that drives true value for patients. So that's, as you know, when you look into a new area and when you go into a new therapeutic area, it's not just a matter of making that choice that I want to enter this space. Well, you've got to have the right asset available to you to enter also, right? Yeah, I can say I want to go do, gene therapy or cell therapy or whatever. It doesn't mean that I can just go and do whatever I want. There has to be a product or an asset that is available. It's at a size that you can absorb, and it's got to have an actual unmet need that you feel that you can fulfill, and then grow the business, right? So a lot of ingredients have to really come together beyond just us wanting to go do something new, and that all of those things came together for us with Ironshore Therapeutics and Jornay. We've now owned the asset, owned Jornay PM for a little over a year, and we are absolutely thrilled with what we have seen. And I say thrilled, when I say thrilled, it's thrilled from our performance. But what we see is significant potential. Right? When we took it over, we saw an opportunity to expand the team, which we did. We expanded the team by more than 40% in April. And those folks have been out there promoting to psychiatrists as well as pediatricians, those are the primary physicians who prescribe the medicine, we're adding new prescribers every single week. We're growing the brand significantly. So a lot of what we believed pre-transaction has played out and is continuing to play out, right? So that's hopefully that gives you a sense of the kind of environment, the kind of ingredients that we look for that I think makes a successful transaction for us. I can't wait to see how this transforms the lives of patients and caregivers over the next several years. And as I look ahead, that's the type of transaction or that's the type of business development we want to do. We want to bring in medicines that can make a difference, that fulfill an unmet need, and then where we can do something with it beyond that create in terms of creating value beyond what the incumbents were able to do. Again, like you said, we can go on and on about this, but I really like the path that we're on, the trajectory that we're on. We're coming from a position of strength, very strong financial foundation, and we're quickly able to make an acquisition or a transaction like we did with Ironshore Therapeutics, and in a very short period of time, re-strengthen our balance sheet to where we were before the transaction. And I think that's what makes our situation quite unique and appealing for our shareholders.
Absolutely. I'm sure there is tons of Pharmaco CEOs that might be listening to this who would do a lot to get into the position that you and the company are in. So congratulations. Really, Vikram, where do you see the future? Do you I mean, obviously there's so many different areas and I don't know what you're allowed to share today. I want to be respectful, of course, but any hints you can give us on where maybe the future trajectory goes and you think about portfolio expansion?
Yeah, well, I have to be mindful of I have to be careful about what I share. But here's what I can say: we like the capital deployment strategy that we have followed, right? So if I take a step back and think about our strategic priorities as an organization, right? Number one, we have to do right by what we have got in our portfolio, right? So accelerating the growth of APM. There's a lot of runway that this medicine has in front of it. We need to make sure we maximize that. Number two, we have a strong base business, the pain business, and we believe that it is much more durable than most people give it credit. So maximizing the durability of that pain franchise, right? So these first two, accelerating journey, maximizing the durability of the pain franchise. This is essentially making sure that we are executing and operating with what we have in the portfolio. Number three is expanding the portfolio, right? Having a very sound capital deployment strategy, a very disciplined capital deployment strategy, and making sure we're continuing to strengthen the company. I get asked a lot of questions about, are you going to build a pipeline of development stage assets? Well, down the road, that would be a great idea. But if I start to take that kind of risk today, I think that would be, it would be a head scratcher. So what we're trying to do is continue to build out a portfolio, focus on commercial or near commercial assets, and then down the road, continue to build out a whole portfolio of programs that we can be proud of and drive the longevity of the company. One thing I want to give a nod back to technology, AI, digital. When you and I first spoke, I know that it's a topic, it's a passionate area for you, it's a passionate area for me. I do think that the way we operate in our industry today, compared to what I think you will see in the next 2 to 3 years, is going to be dramatically different in terms of how we leverage technology, how we leverage digital platforms, AI, large language processing, all of that, I think is going to dramatically change how we bring medicines to the market and how we launch them and how we commercialize them. So very exciting area of significant interest for me and should be for our industry as well.
The great thing about Vikram, I'm saying this to the listeners, is that he knows where I'm going next. And he knew I was right about to go on to emerging technologies. Vikram, you and I did have an opportunity to talk a lot about AI. And it's interesting. I get approached by many pharma CEOs who hear the term, who understand how to, of course, use ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, but they're looking to better understand how it might apply into their space. How are you thinking about, are you all thinking about application of AI across all areas of the organization? Are you mainly just focused on commercial and R&D? how are you thinking about some of the ways you can capture this? Just given, again, you have an understanding of this and a leg up over many big pharma CEOs and who don't really necessarily have the level of depth and understanding that you do when it comes to artificial intelligence.
Look, I don't profess to know how larger company CEOs are thinking, and those are very accomplished individuals with a strong track record of success. So all I can speak to is how we're thinking about it. Okay, I think that the fact that there is no obvious answer tells you something, right? And what that tells you is you have to make it your own, right? I think, but when we think about AI, it's certainly the buzzword, and everybody's saying it, but I'm not sure people have figured out exactly what it means for them. And what that tells me is that before we start thinking about leveraging AI and solutions, you got to first figure out where you're going to use it and what your needs are. How can it help? And then be pinpointed about executing in that area. So being very targeted. As an example, and this is very much true in rare disease, but it can be applied in other areas as well. When we think about how we go to market with our medicines, we have sales forces. These sales forces traditionally they figure out their routing, they do their 2-week routing, they know which physicians to call on, they call on those physicians with certain level of frequency. That was in lieu of any other information. Now, what if I told you that based on a detailed analysis that we were able to run on large data sets, where we can start to predict, what that longitudinal journey for a patient could look like, which now means I can tell my sales force and my sales representatives that you need to not just come up with some routing based on some unknown parameters. Now I need you to go to this physician because there's an actual patient that is eligible for our treatment, right? And that patient will likely be visiting this physician at such and such point in time because they're in this phase of their patient journey. Now you start to be a bit more intelligent and targeted and more precise with how you're going to market. Right? To me, that's how we're thinking about it. Now, the answer is not obvious because, the longitudinal journey for an ADHD patient, especially depending on if you're a child or an adolescent or if you're an adult, could look dramatically different. So this goes back to spend a lot of time in analyzing available data sets, and those data sets could be directly applicable data sets or behavioral data sets or what have you. Really spend the time to understand the patient journey and then think about how to deploy AI to be, targeted about where you send your or how you deploy your go-to-market model. I think that's kind of how we're thinking about it. And I imagine that I'm not the only one who's talking about it. I think there are other CEOs and other leaders who are thinking about it the same way.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's you're absolutely right about that. Like the most successful implementations and deployments, I don't care if it's happening in drug discovery, drug development, R&D, commercial.
Yeah.
It starts by understanding the pain points and the problems and the needs first, finding ways of uniquely applying the technology in a way to drive the types of results that you and I have discussed, both on some of what you're talking about here right now on this episode. Again, Vikram, I have to say, and it's interesting, right? Because you touched on a lot of interesting trends too. Like, how can we leverage the value? How can we leverage technology to address the digital blind spot that exists between patients and HCPs? How can we map those out, leveraging technology in very unique ways? But no, Vikram, listen, I mean, look, this has been a lot of fun. I know for certain you have to come back on again. We have to do this again, because there's so many topics and themes I thought we'd hit on today. We didn't even have the opportunity to do, just because this has been such an interesting and exciting discussion. So again, I want to thank you for coming on today, and I'm looking forward to the next time you're on.
Chase, thank you for having me, and I enjoyed our conversation, the first one as well as this one. Happy to come back again anytime and discuss what we're doing, and hopefully by then, the next time I'm here, we can dive into a little bit of depth into some of the programs that we're implementing, specifically as it relates to AI and precision targeting and so on and so forth.
I would love that. Thank you so much, Vikram.